and welcome to Season 5 of Teaching Matters, a podcast from the Psych Sessions Network. I'm Eric Landrum from Boise State University, one of Teaching Matters' 3 co-hosts. My other 2 co-hosts are Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University and Adeyinka Akinseler-Smith from City College of New York. And we do say goodbye to another co-founder of this podcast, Asani Sewell, in episode 6 of this season 5. These 10 episodes of season 5 were recorded from July 2022 through March of 2023 and are released on 10 consecutive Saturdays in 2023, starting on March 18th and continuing through May 20th. Oh, the places we'll go. We'll open with a current discussion of AI and ChatGPT. Then we'll harken back to mid-2022, where we had multiple conversations with different members of the Society for Teaching of Psychology, that's STP, and different task force leaders about their work. We'll chat about career transitions and changes, one time generically and one time specifically, as podcast co-founder Asani Sewell joins us sadly, for the last time, as a regular, and discusses her departure from the podcast. In the remaining episodes, we discuss other classic topics that are, yes, beyond teaching. How do we handle students and other professionals and how they address us? We talk about the rituals of higher education and how they relate to our regular daily lives, with special meaning for Eric. A discussion about the special skill of peer reviewing, and then a discussion about applying for honors and awards, why it's good for you, your department, and why you should apply as a role model, even if you think you might not receive the award. It's all part of the knowledge and skills that psychology professionals need to know about, the stuff that we are not taught in graduate school. That is beyond teaching. Welcome to Season 5. Hi, welcome back to another special episode of Beyond Teaching. We're thrilled to be here today with a special guest. We're going to introduce her in a minute. I am Eric Landrum from Boise State University, and my co-host will introduce themselves.
And I'm Yinka Akinseler-Smith from the City College of New York, City University of New York.
And I'm Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University. And we're really excited to have Jess Hartnett here with us today. She does lots of awesome stuff, which maybe we'll get into a little bit, but we're specifically talking to her today about her role chairing STP's Presidential Statistical Literacy, Reasoning, and Thinking Task Force. So welcome, Jess, and we'll let you introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about yourself generally.
Sure thing. It's funny when you struggled over it because I could never remember the name of the task force either. There were just a lot of words. Like good statsy stuff task force. That's us.
I started by calling it just statistical literacy, and I kept getting people emailing me saying it can't be just that. So
I see. And we ended up with a very long name for our task force, which I became involved with. There was a call for people for that task force, and I responded to the call. And I recommend anyone who's thinking about getting more involved with STP to watch out for those presidential task forces. Come, December every year? November?
They get posted anywhere between October and December. So okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because those are typically maybe stuff that's going on, stuff that's kind of bubbled to the surface that maybe STP needs to address. And it's a nice 1-year project that, not for me, that you can get involved with. And I highly recommend getting involved with STP. I think I was then asked to be president by chair by then President Susan Nolan. And I think that maybe I was asked because I think about the teaching of statistics a whole lot. I blog about the teaching of statistics. Actually, like next year will be 10 years of blogging, which I can't believe.
Let's give a shout out to your blog, Not Awful and Boring.
Not Awful and Boring Ideas for Teaching Statistics, because I wasn't trying to I talked to Eric about some of this. I wasn't trying to think up of a clever personal brand 10 years ago, because we didn't have personal brands maybe. But I wanted there to be a fairly low bar for what people were expecting from me. And it just turned into, I teach a lot of stats classes in my job here at Gannon University. I think about the teaching of stats a lot, and when I find a new idea or way of teaching, I like to share it to the blog. I think it's especially helpful. I was just looking through, like, as teaching today, and I feel like stuff gets dated faster than it did before. Like references and memes and popular TV shows, I feel like we cycle through it really, really fast. Like I was thinking about, like, it'd be funny to make an IO class about this Don't Worry Darling movie that came out that was apparently like organizationally terrible. Like people are very mad about it that were involved in it as an organization. And then I realized, yeah, but no one's going to care about that in 15 minutes. So don't do that. And I feel like it's accelerated, which is why I keep on finding more stats examples to share with everyone. And I hope it makes life easier for my colleagues and peers.
It does.
Great.
So once you became chair of the statistical, let's just call it the Statistical Literacy Task Force.
Do it.
And then we don't have to remember the full long name. Once you became chair of the Statistical Literacy Task Force, do you want to talk a little bit about process? It was a large task force, and you had two sub chairs, I guess. They weren't co-chairs. They were, you might want to describe the organization.
Yeah, well, and again, it was easy because there was a fair amount of guidance from up on high, and we came up with this idea that we needed kind of two prongs to the task force. This is the second of this sort of task force, and we took some cues from the previous task force. One of the cues we took was, I believe the previous task force came up with a list of standards and ideas of topics that should be addressed in intro stats and the undergraduate psychology degree. And we took a different take on that with Garth Neufeld, and he decided to, and with the group, decided to create worksheets to create modules that fit into an intro psych class. So this is the big question that's being attacked on a lot of fronts, right? Like, what do we do with intro psych? Should it just be Psych Jeopardy? Or what do we want students to understand in 5 years and 10 years? So we were trying to, again, in the spirit of helping out our colleagues, come up with easy, simple, out-of-the-box ways that you could have this little learning module that would correspond with your developmental psych or your cognitive psych, one chapter introduction and intro, and it would further kind of emphasize and cement the stats research knowledge. And that's another thing to say, we didn't really, like, I don't teach a combined stats research class, but I don't think you can completely divide research methods and stats ever. And I think that's a strength because it shouldn't just be a math class. It should be taught in context as a problem-solving tool. I can talk about that for a long time. But in this case, in this instance, we decided to go in that direction where we were going to help out by bringing stats knowledge to every typical topic from intro. And then the other prong, we decided to look more at, there's lots of ways to teach statistics. All right. So if you're in the Twitter sphere where everything's like moving at a neck break speed and everyone's very opinionated, like you're teaching Bayesian or you're not worth anything. Like you've completely converted to Bayesian stats, or you're doing it wrong. Right. But if you actually look at the real way that people teach stats, there's still lots of stats classes taught with SPSS. P is less than 0.05 isn't going anywhere, but maybe we could add effect sizes, right, and confidence intervals to that. So we wanted a clear view of what is actually being taught. And we did a survey, and we're still processing some of the, not the data, but we're still editing the document, but we hope to get it out soon. Looking at all of the ways that we teach stats, and also the ways that we integrate stats into other psychology courses and how we do that, including not just p-values, but do you touch on the replication crisis? Do you talk about power? Do you talk about effect sizes in all of your classes, or is that just stat specific and it doesn't get mentioned anywhere else?
Any particularly surprising findings in your survey? I know you're giving us a sneak preview before it gets out there.
I'm always continue to be a little surprised in the amount of people that still teach with SPSS. I also believe, like, I don't think that R is inherently better. I think that, I mean, I'm at a small school where I teach a lot and I don't have time to learn R. I'll be honest to you. Like, I don't. So I use point and click JASP, which is
use JASP as well. I don't have time to learn R either. I'm with you.
But again, if you go to the Twitter sphere, you feel like Queen Dum Dum of the Dum Dum clubs, right? If you're not
Totally.
using like R to do your Bayesian research, right? But it's not actually like that in real life, right?
Did you want to jump in, Yinka?
I just wanted to say my question actually was going to be, I'm listening to you say all this. Now, bear in mind, I'm one of these people who, when I was going through my doctoral program, my dissertation advisor was one of these folks who you were not going to give your data to someone else to analyze. You had to learn how to do it yourself and be, really knowledgeable about it. And been there, did that, dropped it, and then moved on. And so now with my research, I collaborate with people who I know are good statisticians who can analyze the data. But I guess my question really for you, Jess, is so for those of us who are like me, who were, I every now and then I think, I should go back and learn some more and be a little more comfortable with all this, but not the students, but for those of us who are in the field, who are faculty, like how do we get our fingers back in this pie?
Well, again, I recommend JASP software to anyone because SPSS is rather RAM intensive and it's really expensive, but JASP is free and JASP will not intimidate you. If you can use SPSS, you can use JASP. So I've recommended it to several people, like someone from like the board of trustees at my kid's school who's like an Episcopal bishop. I recommended it to him because he wanted to analyze a little bit of data, right? That's what I would do. And I would recommend doing pedagogy research too. I think that I would have died like a long time ago if I couldn't double dip, right? Like it would be lovely if I could be the bestest researcher in the world, but again, I don't have time for that, but I have to teach a lot of stats classes. And pedagogy research has been a saving grace for me because it allows me to, I do best in life when all of my focus is on the same thing. I am not a multitasker. So if I'm at a teaching intensive university, but I can also do research about teaching, I'm going to function better. So again, pedagogy research, I think, is the good middle ground. If you want to get into a little bit more research, but you know that research isn't your passion.
In Yinka's case, she does a ton of research. She just isn't doing the stats.
I just don't do the data analysis piece.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would keep on finding someone else to do your data analysis. Like, honestly, like that's what I would do.
It's not my strength.
No, and we're too busy, right? Like you need to have your gang of people that you're going to write with and everyone does their own task.
Yeah.
I think we tend to teach, if you teach stats, or you tend to do your stats the way you were taught.
Yep.
I think it's just kind of a default. I was taught SPSS. I actually did SPSS on punch cards.
What?
Back in the Stone Age.
Oh, Eric.
Punch
And
cards.
for those of you who are listening, Eric is actually showing us punch cards on his screen.
He's
If you're into
flaunting them,
ASMR,
actually.
there you go. And and we have SPSS as a site license on our campus. But to Jess's point, I think JASP is a fine alternative. I really wish that we would teach more statistics through Excel, because 57% of our psychology majors will never go to graduate school. They'll never go to professional school. They go straight into the psychology workforce, and many of them will be using Excel on a regular basis. And again, it's just like, I don't know how to use R, but I'm not a real power user of Excel either. If you give someone the ability to use pivot tables in Excel,
I
it's
learned
an
that
employable skill.
last week. I
Pivot
learned
tables are a
Oh,
powerful tool in Excel,
yeah.
and they will help a person get employed and stay employed.
Mary Ann Lloyd at Seton Hall, where I am, she teaches stats with Excel. And so Yeah, I think that's.
But you have to
another
learn
great-
it just like you have to learn JASP or R, whatever the cost of the program. And Excel obviously has a cost with
But
Microsoft Suite.
I agree. I want to second JASP. The first time I used it, I taught a grad stats class with it, and I had only played with it for about 2 weeks before the semester started. I admitted that to my student, which I have to admit at the time I was a full professor, and it's a privilege to be able to go into class and tell your students that you don't know something at all. But it was really great. And we made it our project for the semester to develop a stats, a JASP manual. And Jess, am I right that JASP stands for just another statistics program or something like that?
I'm not sure about that, but I could double check. We could Google that right now.
Yeah,
I'm not
Google it
exactly
right
sure.
now.
Yink is on it.
But it was easy to use.
Yeah.
So that much easier than Excel. In fact, you have to organize your data in Excel and then upload it into JASP to run the analyses. You can't play around with your data in JASP. So you have to have at least basic Excel skills to use JASP.
Or Google Sheet. Well, could it use a Google Sheet?
I believe so, but I
Probably.
haven't done it. So
Yeah.
Yeah. What else do you want to tell us about the process of your presidential task force and the outputs you decided on, and just any tips for people going into one of those task forces where suddenly a whole bunch of people from all different backgrounds are thrown together?
Well, it was funny because our very first task force meeting was on January 6th, that January 6th.
Oh,
And
that
it was in the
January 6th.
afternoon, and like people like were in the meeting talking, but you could also see like you could see facial expressions from people that had like TVs on in the background. So after that auspicious start, we got together, we talked, and by that point we already had the idea for the 2 subgroups, right? So I asked people, which would you prefer? Would you prefer weaving more stats into intro psych, or would you prefer kind of coming up with a big research idea to see how we actually teach stats? And not everyone got what they wanted, but everyone still played along pretty well because I tried to divide it into kind of 2 even groups.
Yeah.
And then after that, my task force sub-chairs did a whole lot of work of organizing meetings, assigning work, coming up with the exact way that we're going to do this. I would say that it took a lot of talking in the bigger group that looked at stats across the curriculum and stats the way it's taught to kind of figure out how do we ask these questions. And then they kind of realized we can't just ask people that teach stats if they teach stats. We need to ask everyone else who teaches psychology how much stats they teach. So then it ended up being 2 different surveys. And actually, I would say that group actually generated like 10 years worth of different projects that we knew that we didn't have time for, but we had all of these ideas for like going into course books for different universities and figuring out if stats is required or recommended, and the sequence of these classes at different universities and different kinds of universities, right? So there's stats people asking questions about the teaching of stats. So they kind of took off with that. We ended up having our survey, and people took different chunks of the questions to analyze the data.
Jess, did you want to give a shout out to your sub-chairs?
Yes, Garth Neufeld was in charge of the intro psych and integrating stats into intro psych subgroup. And he was a natural choice because, and he even admitted this very openly, that he doesn't teach stats and he's not the stats expert, but he's certainly an intro psych expert. And as we were creating those materials, he was really empathetic to a lot of people that teach intro psych might not have the most intensive stats background. They could be graduate students who are busy. They could be adjuncts that are super busy and underpaid. So we paid kind of special attention, and he kept on bringing it back to kind of keeping the instructors in mind. And Erin Freeman from University of Oklahoma was in charge of the other group. Erin Freeman is in charge of psych stats at University of Oklahoma. So she thinks about psych stats a whole lot. And she was really good at helping everyone kind of generate this list of questions, which means you also need response scales, which means the psychometrics of it get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And I think that we could do a lot more research as a group if we just had like infinite time. But she did a great job of coming up with the survey. She took care of the IRB. She created the survey using her university's software. And they were both great leaders for each group.
Can I add a shout out here? Jess, this goes back to something you said at the very beginning, that I picked up on. I want to add a shout out to Susan Nolan, because she did something here that I recognized. She had an open call for this task force, and you put your name in, and she named you as the chair of it. And groups like STP and PsyChi and other organizations oftentimes get accused of being insular or kind of closed knit. And sometimes they are, because it's the same people who serve over and over again. I think this is a really nice example of you weren't handpicked. In fact, Susan had no idea you were going to chair this, because you volunteered and she picked you from people who submitted their names. And so I like this example of someone bubbled up to the surface, and look what a fantastic job you and your group ended up doing. So bravo to Susan and bravo to Jess.
Thanks,
Yay,
Eric.
Susan.
Yay.
Well, they had such good people offer their names. It was just, yeah, it was fabulous.
I know, but this is a purposeful strategy that you use that is not cliquish. I mean, organizations like PsyChi, organizations like STP, and so many others, either within APS or other divisions of APA, get accused of being cliquish. And sometimes we are, but this is an example of, it was an open call.
Yeah. And I want to say that the task forces generally are open calls. And I think this is a really important point, and Jess made it earlier. This is a great way to, this is how I started getting involved in STP, actually, was volunteering for a presidential task force. So I think this is a really great way for people who are interested to just try it out for a year. You can go away after a year. Many of the leaders don't, because they want to see their outcome end up in the world. As an example, you, Jess. But for the members, many of them really can just do the work for a year and try it out.
Sometimes gestation is more than 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the case of some of the task forces, we've had DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion related task forces for several years running, and the work keeps feeding into the next one because that's just ongoing. So yeah. Do you want to talk about, you can either more about the presidential task forces or a little bit about your own experience teaching stats at Gannon?
Well, I will say, just looking at the makeup of the task force, we had extremely talented people. And when you get real fired up about teaching stats, that can be a lonely road, right? Because every time like you tell someone, oh, I teach stats, they're like 90% of the time, oh, I hated stats, right? Like that's the reaction. And even amongst your peers, sometimes my enthusiasm is not shared. But it was so nice professionally and personally to meet like a dozen other professors that are totally fired up about teaching stats. And that is the professional development. Like you might not pick up on it here, but I'm introverted and I like to teach about stats when I do talk. So it was nice to have this clear vision with all these people working together, meeting all of these people. And we had just a really good interactions. We had good meetings. People like pitched in work, people volunteered for work. And it was really interesting where when you're talking about self-selection, these are all people that volunteered for the presidential task force on statistics and doing things good, right? So that was moving and it was good for my professional networking. One of the people on the task force, Vimal, he's a graduate student because you can be a graduate student and work on these task forces.
Mm-hmm.
He's going from Minnesota to Penn State to give a talk, and he's going to stop in Gannon and give a talk about, because he does research about the teaching of statistics and as well. So I've met these people at conferences. Some have become friends. Again, I'm happy to write letters of recommendation all day long for all of these people, which you never know when you're going to need something like that, right? So I just think it really is a considerable professional connection that introduces you to people that are passionate about the same stuff you are.
Susan, can I ask you, you're a well-established intro statistics textbook author with multiple revisions. What these types of documents that have come out in the past and the one that's in process now, what type of level of influence have they had as you and your co-authors have been revising textbooks? I mean, maybe you've known about a lot of those things already in the works, and a task force just kind of summarizes. And that, or what kind of influence, if any, do these
Oh,
types of works have for you?
absolutely. And actually, I chaired the previous statistical literacy task force, and very much that work informed the writing of my stats textbook. And absolutely knowing, like, for example, the move away from SPSS, even though people still use it, we used to have a section at the back of each chapter on SPSS. In the new revision that we're working on right now, we're removing those, we're putting them in the online material, and we're adding equivalent ones for JASP and R. And Kelly Gettert, who was on the task force with Jess, is my new stats co-author, and she is good in R, very good in R, and I can play with JASP. So yeah, so this kind of work really does influence things like that. And Jess, you too. How about, what's your answer to that question?
I hope it kind of gives a voice for sometimes people. I don't know. I think there's a movement to have a more applied version of stats taught to psychology majors. And I think there need to be more voices saying that's okay. Because sometimes I feel like there's this perception where if you're not belaboring doing everything by hand, that you're somehow dumbing it down. And I think that's really paying short shrift to our students, because professionals, like, you had your punch cards, right? Like, should we just teach punch cards because that's the way we've always done it? No, right? Should we just teach by hand because that's way? No, absolutely not. And it's nice to see these little, like, responses to the survey questions where professors are saying that they wish they could be more applied, or they need to put more stuff in the stats classes and they don't know how to put more stuff in the stats classes. And I think one way to do that is to get away from by hand calculation. So that has been interesting to see kind of that coming through. And also it's like a big generational shift. Another thing that came up that I didn't appreciate enough is some professors that are maybe still teaching in older ways have to, because of even older professors in their department that teach the research methods class or teach the undergraduate thesis class.
Right.
So
it's a whole
don't have
ecosystem.
as much freedom to teach what you think should be taught, because you know that they're going to run into this other professor who's not going to let them use JASP. This other professor. And again, I have a department where we kind of decided as a group to all switch over to JASP for intro. And we have a 1-credit lab course for psychology majors. And in that lab course, they learn R.
Yeah, I think if you can get everybody on the same page in the same ecosystem, it makes a lot of sense. But I think you've both touched on, if you have older, more senior professors, or let's even say untrained, you can have untrained younger professors or newer professors. Again, we tend to teach how we were taught. So if all you know is SPSS and someone comes along and says, we want you to teach in R. Well, I never learned R. It's really, you have to be motivated. And the way that if it's disconnected, I could make the argument, you could learn it by hand in stats, but it doesn't matter when you get to my research methods. I can teach it no matter what. And there's different models around the country. I've visited places where they take research methods first and stats second, and so different places do it differently, and they will tell you that their students are successful because they make it happen that way.
And I would just like to add 2 quick things and then actually throw the ball to Yinka. The first is that to some degree, I don't mind if students see different software from class to class. And I actually tell my students, okay, this is JASP, you've used other things before. You need to do this because it's going to change. You're going to be in jobs with different things. And so I think that's a skill. So it kind of depends on a lot of factors, and maybe it's better at the graduate level, but that's something I think that's worth discussing. And then the second is something that Jess alluded to, and it's not so much doing it by hand, but understanding it. And this is where I wanted to throw it to Yinka, because you're working, as a clinician and a researcher, and, in the academic and the clinical world. A big thing for the students you're working with is understanding it, right? Being able to interpret it when you read it. So you may not even need to know how to do it, but you do need to understand it. And I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, right. I mean, understand it, understand how it applies.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not, the information is significant or the findings are relevant, and how they, how you can take that and use it.
And when I teach my class, because you free up a lot of time in a stats class when you stop doing everything by hand. And I do little mini APA reports. So they're not comprehensive lessons in APA formatting, but you will learn to write one sentence method section under a method header, because again, we have these examples that we're drawing out of the air. So it's not going to be a page-long method section, but you at least learn the basics of that and the very basics of the results and a 1 or 2 sentence discussion section. Because honestly, I think one of the superpowers I want to send my students away with, it's not stats or Psych Jeopardy. Someday when their kid gets sick, I want them to be able to do a literature review and read research on their own. Yeah. Someday when they've left psychology and they're not psychologists anymore, most research papers still follow a certain order, and I want them to be able to advocate for themselves, to fight back, to learn a better way to do a thing, right? And I think that by teaching them how to do these simple APA sections, you're teaching them to be less intimidated by research and statistics, which is a powerful place to be as a person.
Well, and someday I want them to be able to read the claim of a new drug that helps fight COVID and read that claim and go, well, with that number of participants and that claim, it's unlikely that's true. I want to dig for more details. And then when they find it, no, that can't be right. Mm-hmm. And have that sense of that just can't be right. I learned about claims and probability and have that hunch to be able to think like a psychologist.
Yeah, which is why, again, you when you teach interest stats, especially if you're new to it, you're like, oh, they need an OT test. They need to know an OFIS. They need to know absolute and relative risk. Like they need to know truncated y-axes. They need to know the hundreds of ways you can misrepresent data without actually lying. Like
correlation versus causation.
Yeah,
I'm always
right.
Yeah.
You know, it's out of date, and it's not something that you'd want to use. But you know how to lie with statistics. The 1954 Little Red Book. The examples are sexist, so you wouldn't want to use the book. But the premise is really quite good. Yeah. Where they go through and they show all the ways to lie with graphs. Mm-hmm. And you know the truncated axis. You know, starting. You know, all the ways to, you know, you blow up disproportionately 10x versus 100x, mm-hmm. But it's really not 100x, you know, all these tricks.
And I think that needs to be better integrated. And it even, I don't know how the students take it, but I even say, like, I would make you BS proof. Like a lot of people are going to try to lie to you. And I don't want them to lie to you. And I want you to be more conscientious. But I will say, like, especially in my honors class, we talk about all of these instances of people lying with data, misleading with data, clickbait data. And I'm pretty sure they think I need a tinfoil hat. Because at the end of the semester, I'm like, the NFL lied to you. Exxon lied to you. Big Farm lied to you.
Oh, the NFL lies all the time. Yeah.
I have a tinfoil hat. See it?
You do?
On the shelf? Did you see it? It's right there behind me.
I swear I was looking at that and thinking, wondering what that was.
Right. But and I don't want them to be cynical, but I want them to be critical.
Skeptical.
And that can be a fine line sometimes, right? Where you don't want them to be like knee-jerk reaction, all science is bad and evil, but I want them to understand, like, just like we find out that like Teflon's bad for you and bad for the environment and microplastics, and now we have BPA, like there's going to be something else in 10 years that we thought was perfectly safe, right? This is the way things go with manufacturing. And I want the students to be aware and prepared.
I want to be mindful of our time. This has been just great and lots of great things for folks to think about and maybe even change the way they approach it. Is there anything that you wanted to leave as a final thought, Jess, or Eric or Yinka?
Oh, wait. Before Jess gets to her final thought, I want to mention one more thing about Jess. She's been on the podcast before, and we had a great conversation. You can go back in the Psych Sessions archives and search for it.
It was great. I listened to it.
We've mentioned her blog before, and I won't know the numbers as well as Jess, but you know, Jess has been very generous throughout that blog, and there are ideas that I've gotten from it. And I haven't taught stats regularly in a long time, but I subscribe to it and I get it. It comes to my email inbox. And there have been times when some of the ideas have been so fantastic. I've written to Jess and said, just to be sure, do I have permission to share this with every one of my colleagues in my department, but B, every one of my colleagues in my college, because they were just such fantastic ideas. There was a Google slideshow once that at the beginning of the pandemic that was just phenomenal. How to connect with your class if you're at a distance, and shared it with my dean, and I believe that she shared it with department chairs, and it was phenomenal. But that blog is one of these examples of non-traditional impact that we can have. And I think, Jess, you shared with me that at the time you applied for promotion and tenure, at that time you had documented 400,000 downloads or accesses of your blog. Is that right?
I have 500,000 views now.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Right. And it's not a Taylor Swift blog, right? Like
Right.
it's
Stats.
a very specific audience, right?
But
It's Taylor Swift for our world.
I am.
Right. But you think
I'm gonna put that on my book cover right there. Anyway.
But you think about in all seriousness, I mean, the time it takes to curate that blog and to send those out and to have that mailing list. And when you find, and obviously you're excited about this content, but you find it, you write it, you curate it, you give citations and sources for it, 500,000 downloads and links to it, just like Steve Chu and his videos. And, we have folks in our realm who are very generous about this. And I just want to make that known and acknowledge that non-traditional scholarly impact. Yes, we count publications and conference presentations, and those are important. So is your blog, by the way.
Yeah. And documenting it like you do, Jess, it's a great, you talk about this in the psych sessions that you did before, of how you documented it for tenure. And so people want to learn more about that. I think you offer really great tips.
Yeah, because I mean, once you get to Google Scholar data, or even I blog via Blogger, I can see how many countries, I can see how many hits. And it's funny you should mention that, Eric, because every now and then, like an old blog post will suddenly have like 300 views. And I'm like, what did Eric share today? Right?
I'm glad there's some positive output there.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
And, okay, so for my final thought, I have to say it's related to that, where so I'm like tenured and I'm in this place of privilege, but the older I get, the more I see that you really need to define success in academics on your own terms. And not everyone can do this, because you could define it as a blog, right? But if you need publications to get tenure, you're not going to get tenure, right? So again, I'm at a small liberal arts college and I love my job and I love my students and my colleagues, right? Is this the big prestige school? No. Is it going to be that phenomenon, like when people look at one another's badges at a conference, they're like, Gannon where, Gannon who, right? So from these traditional metrics, that's not success, which is BS, because I'm really happy with where I am. And I've been able to have such reach with my blog as a person who doesn't have a fancy academic pedigree, who doesn't have a fancy job, someone who manages to do this while being a mom and a wife and working 40 to 50 hours a week, more like 40. And I just think it's really important to represent that. And also we've made friends with more people. Like, I don't know if you're aware, but there's an IO psychology meme Twitter account, and it's pretty hilarious. And Lisa Kath out at University of California, San Diego, like that's hers. And I've met with her and met her virtually and have published with her because she has that same passion where she can do all the IO and all the research, but she also just has a brain that generates memes about IO topics. And it's just been really liberating to see other people operating in that space where there's just new ways to connect right now. And I was talking to my sister-in-law and we were discussing all the jobs that are going to be really hot in 10 years that we've never heard of before. Like curating social media content, and who knows what's coming, right? And I just feel like if you keep on doing the traditional academic stuff, that's good, but I don't know how that's going to innovate. And I don't know how that's going to share. And I'm writing a stats textbook for Norton right now. And to know that, like, it's Norton. And they were looking for a good teacher and they found her, right? And they found me because I was freely and with love and with humor sharing my ideas without any thought that I was going to profit off of them in any way. I just did it because I know how hard it is and I want to make stats more tolerable. And I have a brain that loves the internet and loves memes and loves funny gifs and silly things like that. And I want to give that away. I just want to give that away, right? And I, again, no pedigree, no fancy like business card, but there's people out there like Norton that are looking for quality, not necessarily pedigree in the more traditional channels through which the academy operates sometimes.
That sounds all pretty fancy to me.
Am I?
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you for sharing
It's
that.
been a great ride. And
Well,
it's
it's just,
been
it
so
really
good.
just speaks to really enjoying what you do. It just comes out.
Right. And I remember being in grad school, I'm like, gosh, I love teaching, but not research as much. And when you're at like a research intensive institution, none of your professors know how to help you if you want to be a teaching professor. And for some of our graduate students, you're not allowed to be a teaching professor. You are not allowed to pick up extra teaching. Like they don't want that because like the academy is kind of a pyramid scheme, right? Where like you have like the mighty professor up here, and then their graduate students go and they cite the mighty professor, and then their graduate student, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And sometimes that goes in front of, like you're saying, it goes in front of passion. It goes in front of what you're actually good at and figuring that out. And I think that's real pity. And I wonder if that's part of why some people can burn out so violently in the academy and turn away from the academy with such, I'm not dismissing it at all, but just a lot of hard feelings and really not feeling good about their graduate experiences. And I wonder if that's because people, the good passions you're allowed to follow are very narrow.
And this is, I think, why we all end up finding each other, those of us who really care about teaching, because
That's why we become tribes and cliques, to stay together, to keep warm.
Right. But an open and inclusive, I hope, quote unquote tribe and clique, where people can infiltrate STP relatively easily by joining a presidential task force, which is bringing us full circle. So,
and I do my little bit, like I try to post those on the Facebook STP group. I try to post those for my own Twitter account when they come around. And I talk about how I've had such great professional success with them. So I think it's more and more people advertising. Like it's one thing to see like that little professional postcard that you might get like sent to your office, but to hear someone whose voice you trust talk about it. That's very valuable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I want to just say when I listen to podcasts, I always by the end forget who they said at the beginning it was. So I like to do that thing where we've been talking with Jess Hartnett from Gannett. Am I saying it correctly? Gannon University.
Elitist.
So the podcast you listen to, they say the affiliation wrong?
Yeah,
Is it
they
the
always say
podcast
at the
you listen
end.
to?
I listen to lots of podcasts. No, thank you so much. And I'm a big admirer of Not Awful and Boring, which I think is very fancy.
Thank you
for bringing your passion for stats.
I'm happy to share it. Thank you for having me on the show, guys.
Always great to talk to you.
Thank you.